Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of DJ Anesh podcast. Today we will be delving into the topic of decolonization. It is a lead up from what we've covered so far in the lecture series on the world in 1945. So, from 1945 on, we've seen that there were major changes, there were significant changes that resulted from the war, not just in terms of physical devastation and misery and that kind of stuff, but also to do with the political landscape, the global political landscape that the world was undergoing at that point in time. So, geopolitics, an important concept for us to keep in mind, and it is shifting from a multipolar world into one that is more bipolar, led by two superpowers. So that's the premise from which we've talked about, and today we are going to be moving forward from 1945 and going into the later years that are preceding that. Today, the topic decolonization is it's one that is pretty complicated. You will soon see that there are many forces and many influences that are shaping the decolonization experience. One thing to note is that the colonies that are undergoing a decolonization process, all of them have somewhat of a different experience. There's a spectrum in terms of the experience, how confrontational it was, how peaceful it was, how gradual it was, how fast it was. All these different elements describe the decol experience, and different colonies would have different decolonization experiences based on what happened from 1945 onwards. But I think generally speaking, it was a time of change. The winds of change were blowing, and I think also that it was a time of upheaval. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of chaos, and Southeast Asia was emerging from this period of time, either stronger nations or comparatively weaker ones. So let's go into the content for today. As I went through with the lecture group, I think maps are really important in Southeast Asia, and to look, especially when you're considering geopolitics. So I think it's a good idea to look at a map of Southeast Asia and to recognize and to remember where all the different countries are. You might be history students, but you will never escape geography, especially when we're dealing with something like geopolitics. So um, I'm I think it's very easy for you to pull out a Google image and to tally the colors of these countries. But the ones that are of primary concern to us is the one in orange, that's Indonesia, used to be called the Dutch East Indies. The ones in pink, somewhere in the middle, it's Malaysia. Remember that for Malaysia, it didn't come into being until 1963. So at this point in time, we will still refer to it as Malaya. Further up north, you can see another pink portion, that's Burma. And I think why they are both in pink is because they were both under the British as their colonial power. So Burma, today modern day Myanmar, but back then it was called Burma. By its side in dark grey is Thailand, never colonized and remained independent throughout our time frame of assessment. The blue countries over there is a collection of three countries. Collectively, they are known as French Indochina. French Indochina is a collection of three countries, the foremost of which is Vietnam. After that, it's Laos and Cambodia. So Laos is the blue one to the top left. Cambodia is the blue one to the bottom left, and Vietnam is the one on the right. And then lastly, you have the yellow one over there, Philippines under the Americans, the colony of the Philippines. Now, when we consider decolonization, the central question that we want to ask is why did different countries experience different types of decolonization processes? Why was the character of their decolonization different compared to fellow countries in the region undergoing the same process? My proposal and my thesis to you is that with the decolonization processes, there are a number of major forces that are influencing how it is shaped. And over here, I'll propose to you 4 forces. Some of them are on the global scale, some of them are on the local scale, but regardless of how extensive the influence is, I do think that each of these 4 movements and influences, they do have a large significance into the politics and the political development of these countries, especially with regards to decor. Now, the first bullet point over there has to do with Europe itself. Most of our colonial powers are from Europe, and by the end of the war, they are devastated, they are in the process of rebuilding, and colonies would play a vital part in their rebuilding process. So, I do believe that all colonial powers were of the interest of coming back to Southeast Asia to re-establish their authority and to use their colonies towards some form of reconstruction. I don't think that at this point in time any European power was in the business of wanting to give up their colonies. The only one that really had some intent to give up the colony was America, perhaps guided by the principle of self-determination and also the fact that the Philippines was relatively stable at that point in time. So the first major influence has to do with Europe, their own considerations and so on. The cost benefit analysis. Does the benefit of holding on to a colony outweigh its cost, or is it the other way around? So is empire and is a colonial situation still sustainable, or is it increasingly unsustainable? So that's to do with the European perspective, their context, their priorities, and so on. That's the first major influence that is going on right now. The second major influence has to do with Southeast Asia. And this relates back to the last lecture on the Pacific. There has been a sizable and tangible growth of Southeast Asian nationalism. It is now a credible force, and it is a force that in some countries it is armed as well. So this is something that the European powers could not ignore any further. And they had to deal with the nationalist movements in some way or another. But you can see that now the Southeast Asian nationalists and their leaders, they do play a significant role in determining what happens with decolonization as well as the pathway to independence. So this major force is on a local scale, but at the same time we can see that it is something that we need to consider because it does play an influence on the political landscape. How strong is the nationalist movement? Who are the nationalists? Does it contain a broad-based section of the population, or is it scoped to a select few group of people, so on and so forth? Number of permutations to consider when you look at the nationalist movement. The third force is on a much, much larger scale, is a global force. We are looking at the era of the Cold War dawning upon the European theatre and later on the entire world. So the European theatre of war, the Cold War in this case, it looks at the bipolarity between the US and the USSR on the other ends of the spectrum. And these are the two superpowers that are fast emerging as the dominant forces in the world. Now, the Cold War in itself has its own set of politics, its own set of political maneuverings and developments and all that. But in this lecture, I want you all to see that the Cold War has secondary effects. The Cold War has extensive effects on the decolonization process as well. Some decolonization processes are speeded up because of Cold War politics. Some of them are slowed down. Some of them are even halted because of Cold War politics as well. The key to all of this is to look at the superpower of America and the kind of influence that they had over our Western colonial powers. So our Western colonial powers back home in Europe, they are American Cold War allies. And over here in Southeast Asia, they are colonial powers, and they do play a part in stemming the tide of communism as well. So later on, we'll see how the Cold War kind of affects all these kind of developments. The last major force that is going on at this point in time, and it's on a global scale as well, it looks at this spirit of decolonization that is permeating the entire world at this point in time after the war. Britain and America, they came up with this thing called the Atlantic Charter, and the Atlantic Charter basically stresses self-determination. And this spirit of self-determination it signals this new post-war era, and it is something that nations are striving towards too. So all across the world, not just in Southeast Asia, decolonization is happening, and you can see it in the continent of Africa, you can see it in the Middle East, you can see it in Asia, and so on. But there's a whole era, this atmosphere of self-determination, a new world, freedoms, and so on and so forth, going on this thing. So how does this spirit manifest in our Southeast Asian story and our Southeast Asian narrative later on? We'll see. So you can see this poster here. Well, the common enemy, Nazi Germany, the wolf as represented there. Well, it is dead. It is destroyed. It is collapsed. But now we have a whole other set of political calculations and political developments that we need to consider in this fast emerging post-war world. Now, I want to go deeper into understanding the term independence and what exactly is involved in this term. Now, when you think about independence, when you think about decolonization, you have to think about it being a legal arrangement. You got to think about it being something that is recognized by the two parties, but also the international community. So, sovereignty and independence, usually there is a legal framework attached to this. So, in the case of independence in Southeast Asia, it is when there is a legal arrangement between colonial powers and the colonized people. It is something that is mutually agreed upon, and usually through a legal set of documents. So the two essential components here are it must be legal and recognized, and also it must be mutually agreed upon by the two parties. What happens in independence or this concept of independence is that there is a transfer of sovereignty, formerly from the colonial powers and now onto the local Southeast Asians. So what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is just basically the idea that of ultimate authority. Ultimate authority and power being vested from someone to someone else. So there's a transference of this authority. It must be mutually agreed upon. It must be ratified by some sort of legal treaties and so on and so forth. It must be internationally recognized. And then this whole thing completes that process of delivering and giving independence or winning independence in that sense. So, what happens when you don't fulfill these conditions? And what happens to independence then? The whole concept of independence is thrown into question, and you look at the countries and you see that, oh, okay, maybe they don't have independence as is stipulated by all these definitions. So this is exactly what happened in Southeast Asia. Now, in Southeast Asia, after the war, after Japan surrenders, there is this thing called the vacuum of power. Now, what is the vacuum of power? It is basically when, at that point in time, in that window, there is no governing authority in the nation. That means vacuum, right? So there's an absence of power. There's an absence of power, there's an absence of an authority in the country, in the nation. Now, how does this come about? Well, it could be because the Japanese surrendered, but it took time for the Western colonial powers to come back into Southeast Asia. So there was about a 2 to 3 month window period where it took time for the Western colonial powers to come back, to set up their administration once again, so on and so forth. So there's this vacuum of power over there. Now, in this vacuum of power, why is it so important to us? It's because in this vacuum of power, some Southeast Asian leaders took the step up. And what they did was that they declared independence for their colonies and their nation. So two of the most notable ones is Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Sukarno in Indonesia. They stepped up in August, they launched an August revolution, and they declared these two countries independent. We take a look at Burma, and Burma, even before the war ends, Japan gives Burma independence. Japan was not doing well in the war, and this was, you don't have to go into the intricacies of it, but this was one of the ways in which Japan was trying to manage its war costs and to prevent further disruptions from Southeast Asia. So they declared Burmese independence, quote unquote. Now, all these declarations of independences or a given independence from the Japanese occupation, all these things do not fulfill the definitions, the stipulations that we set about independence back then. Because while all these things are either self-declared or they are given, they were not recognized by the authority, which is the Western colonial power. So at that point in time, there is no mutually agreed upon situation. The international community did not recognize all these um, declarations of independence as well. So this is what we call a unilateral declaration of independence. Unilateral, the name suggests that this is something self-declared, and it doesn't fulfill the other conditions. So while Ho Chi Minh, Sukarno, and Aung San, they have all been put into positions where it seems like their countries are now independent and that's the end of the story. Goodbye, Western colonial powers. No, it doesn't work that way. So the Western powers are still coming back, and what's going to happen is that there's going to be a series of negotiations, and we'll see how that turns out. So this two-party rule, both parties must recognize it, both parties must agree to it. Then I think we would consider a colony decolonized. The first one of the most explosive decolonization case studies is Vietnam. Vietnam, just a bit of a recap, they are under French colonial rule together with Laos and Cambodia. Now, I think this is something that you might have already foreseen. When the French return, they reject the August Declaration. They reject the unilateral declaration of independence that Ho Chi Minh proclaimed. So I think everyone knew that was going to happen, even Ho Chi Minh himself. But this was the situation. Now the second point over here is pretty interesting because the second point over here looks at Ho Chi Minh as a communist party member. And for all you think about the communists, about their revolutionary tendencies, their violence and disruptions and so on and so forth, take a look at the first mode of option, the actions that he took was to enter negotiations with the French. So at that point in time, what they did was that they entered into some form of negotiations. At this point, I'm going to pause for a while because I think someone needs to use the venue. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, sorry about that. I'm back. So where was I? Now, with regards to the communists and what we think of them, for all the revolutionary tendencies that we see of them, Ho Chi Minh entered into negotiations with the French. And in these negotiations about the future of Vietnam, what the situation came to be was that Ho Chi Minh was in a position, I think he was in a pretty good position with bargaining power and a sense of leverage. He demanded for full and complete independence and an immediate one at that as well. While the French, they were trying to weave their way around things and they proposed this idea of a French Union. At that point in time, the popular perception of the French Union and schemes like this was that it was another way, another disguised way for colonial powers to continue their control over the colony. So it looks like it's decolonization, but it actually isn't. So there was huge skepticism over the French Union. There was a lot of suspicion and so on and so forth. So obviously, with this kind of gridlock, Ho Chi Minh wanting immediate independence, the French trying to maneuver their way into a French Union with Vietnam, I think that came into a big problem, and there's a stalemate in negotiations. Things got heated, and they realized that okay, I can't go through like this any further. There's no way forward. There's an impasse. There's a deadlock, so on. So immediately there becomes a breakdown in the negotiations, and kind of that's where our warfare begins. So before I get into the warfare, you can take a look at this map over here that shows the territory of Indochina. Vietnam itself is divided into three administrative zones, if you want to think about it that way. There's Tonkin at the north, there's Annam in the central region, and then there's Cochin China in the south. So most of Ho Chi Minh's forces are concentrated in the north, in Tonkin, and most of the French forces are concentrated in Cochin China in the south. So Vietnam is split in this manner. So with the breakdown in negotiations and when diplomacy has failed, both parties decide to confront, and they get launched into the first Indo-China War, and you can see that this Indo-China War, this first Indo-China War, there will be two more to come as we go down the time frame. But right now, the first Indo-China War, you can see is a really long period of time. It's a long period of open warfare. It lasts for about 8 years. Now, how and why did it all come to this? The first one, you can take a look. We take a look at our four forces that I mentioned at the start of lecture, and we try to use those as lenses in which to view the situation and to understand the development. So the first one, the European perspective. Now, France is humiliated during the war, and they are on the pathway to recovery, both in terms of economics and in terms of their national prestige. So they were never ever in the mind frame or in the mindset to want to let go of Indochina. It's too vital to them, economically speaking, but also in terms of political prestige. So it was never going to be a situation where the French would budge on this issue, and I think that is one of the big accounting reasons why the French themselves engaged into warfare. The second global force that is going on at this point in time is that we are looking at global decolonization. At this point in time, there's there's a spirit of self-determination and so on and so forth. But as I cautioned you all earlier on just now, what this thing is, it really is a spirit of self-determination. But there's nothing mandatory, there's nothing legal about it, there's nothing really obligatory about it as well. So even though there's this spirit hanging in the air, if there are larger priorities, it might be cast aside. So the spirit of self-determination, the spirit of decol, actually it might be cast aside if not handled well. And in this situation, if there are other larger priorities to this whole thing. So in this case, what the Americans and the French, so the Americans, they threw their support behind the French, and they said, well, don't lose Vietnam. Continue to prevent the communists from gaining a victory over there, and the idea is don't lose Vietnam. So global decol, self-determination, at this point in time, didn't really apply, or it didn't seem to apply for Vietnam. Southeast Asian nationalism, the other lens that we look at Ho Chi Minh and his forces, and by this point in time, the communists have managed to well themselves with nationalism. So the communists are seen as nationalists, and they are seen as nationalists that are fighting against a foreign intrusion. They are fighting against a foreign power trying to subjugate them. So it is a very easy message to sell to your people that you are defending your country, you are defending your fatherland against the intrusion from the external power. So at that point in time, the communists, they are in a good ground. They have a pretty sizable force. They have the spirit of nationalism behind them. They have the hearts and minds of people, and so they are in a good ground. And obviously, they are also not going to budge. They are also not going to compromise, and so on. So that's Southeast Asian nationalism. And the last one, the Cold War. I hinted at it when we looked at the second point over here, but the Cold War is the overriding influence that seemed to dominate the Vietnam case study. What happened here is that because the, the local nationalist force is connected to communism, so immediately Cold War politics comes into play. The idea of domino theory, containment policy, and so on and so forth. All these things would come into play, and therefore it escalated the situation much, much further. Um, and of course, it also sidelined the idea of self-determination. So the Americans actually threw their support behind the French, and what eventually became as the first Indochina War was an 8-year-long period of active warfare. It is not something small. It includes and it involves massive amounts of the military force. But after 8 long years of warfare, in 1954, there was a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu. And in this decisive battle between the Vietnamese and the French forces, the Vietnamese actually dealt a critical blow to the French forces, enough to force the French to reconsider their entire control over Indochina and Vietnam. And in fact, shortly after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the two parties went to Geneva to try to draw up a peace agreement and a peace accord. So it was through blood, sweat, and tears, sheer effort on the part of the Vietnamese nationalists that they forced the French into a corner, and after that they had to sue for peace at Geneva. So by 1954, Vietnam had become independent. So the only outstanding issue was that at this point in time, in the 1954 Geneva agreements, Vietnam is independent but divided. So they are divided at the 17th parallel. So you may want to ask, why is there this division at the 17th? Well, because of what I told you earlier, when the war concludes and when the war ends, most of Ho Chi Minh's forces are concentrated in the north, most of the French and the South Vietnamese forces are concentrated in the south. So what happens there is that, to be fair to the situation as to when the war concluded, they decided to temporarily draw a line, and this became the 17th parallel, and there were scheduled to be elections 2 years later, where Vietnam would vote for a popular government, and this popular government would be the authority over a reunified Vietnam. So the story goes that these elections never did happen, and there are two big questions now, and both of them concern the American role. The first question is, what role did the Americans play when it concerned the French defeat and the French withdrawal? That's number one. The second question is, why didn't these elections happen? Now, the first answer to the question, the answer to the first question is this. By the point in time of Dien Bien Phu, 1954, the popular opinion was not with the French, in the sense that people were getting behind the idea and the spirit of self-determination. This concept of empire and overseas colonies, it was fast dying out, and people couldn't throw their support behind this kind of concept any longer, because in some ways it concerned a moral situation. Like, why would you entertain a situation where a foreign power is ruling over someone else? Like, that concept had become outdated, this idea of empire and overseas colonies. So the Americans, they actually read such signs, and they sensed a change in the atmosphere as well. And so when it came time to assess their relationship with France and with this situation in Vietnam, by 1954, when France lost at Dien Bien Phu, what happened was that the Americans had a change in their foreign policy, and they decided that at this point in time, it is no longer sustainable to use Cold War politics and to throw their weight behind France in this matter. So morally speaking, the Americans held themselves up to this standard, and this standard had been crossed. So they could no longer, it was unsustainable to continue to support France, and immediately they swung over to the spirit of self-determination and those kind of rhetoric that went on. That's the answer to the first question. The second question is, why didn't the elections happen in 1956? And this is where a bit of the American hypocrisy starts to come in a bit. Because why didn't these elections come in 1956? Because once again, the Americans could sense the political mood in Vietnam. And they feared that if a popular elections was held in Vietnam, the communists would win legally and by the popular vote. So this presents a huge problem to them because it's as if they are going to hand over the entire country and the entire situation to the communists because they can foresee that this is going to happen. And it's a great testament of how popular the communists are that the Americans are also worried about this transition of power. So, long story short, at the end of the day, these elections didn't happen, and Vietnam continued to be split at the 17th parallel until 1975, a whole 21 years later. In fact, Vietnam would have to go through another war in order to get their country reunified. So, that's a story for another time. But at this point in time, we leave Vietnam here, where by 1954, they are decolonized by the French, but they are split at the 17th parallel into North and South Vietnam. We now move on to the case study of Indonesia, and I'd like you all to see that there are quite a number of similarities when we compare Indonesia with Vietnam, the story of their decolonization. But at the same time, okay, there are quite significant differences as well. Now, Sukarno, like Ho Chi Minh, utilized the vacuum of power. These leaders, they can sense when opportunity is at play and they will utilize it, they will capitalize on it as best as they can. What Sukarno did was that in the vacuum of power, he started to form his cabinet, he started to form an administration so that in anticipation that when the Dutch return, he would be able to present this nationalist government in waiting. And so there could be a smoother transition of authority and sovereignty to the locals. So he prepares and maneuvers his way through the political landscape in order to get to this stage of consolidation of his power and a formation of a government in waiting. Obviously, like the French, when the Dutch came back, they also rejected Sukarno's declaration of independence for pretty much the same reasons as why the French rejected Vietnam. The Dutch also rejected Indonesia. So what happened was also a period of negotiation. Sukarno entered the negotiation with the Dutch, and quite similar also. Sukarno wanted independence and so on and so forth. But the Dutch, they were also proposing a scheme quite like the French Union, but this time it's the Netherlands Union, it has its own name and all that kind of stuff. But the idea is the same. The popular perception at that point in time was that the local nationalists saw these kind of schemes as a disguise for continued colonialism. So obviously the nationalists, they rejected it as well. They are full of nationalist fervor. And don't forget, at this point in time, they have the physical size as well as the military backing in order to make a stand in that sense. So negotiations collapse and also Indonesia enters into a period of hostilities. Indonesia is a really, really complex chain of islands, and collectively it is known as an archipelago. And it's very difficult to hold the entire nation together, but that's what the nationalists did try to do. So as the Dutch and Indonesians, their diplomacy started to collapse across this archipelago, sporadic instances of violence would emerge. One of the earliest ones in September 1945 begins the Battle of Surabaya, where local nationalists, fight against the returning colonial powers and so on and so forth. So there are acts of violence. There is a high element of confrontation and physical violence in Indonesia. Things start to escalate even further, with the Dutch launching a series of police actions against the Indonesians, especially those agitating for independence and for the decolonization of Indonesia. So the Dutch, they really do mean business at that point, and they are willing to use military force in order to control the population and all these nationalist independence kind of agitations. So in July 1947, what happened was that the Dutch launched a police action against Indonesia, and at that point in time, the Americans, they threw their support behind the Dutch as well. So what happened at that point in time is that the Americans were also fearful that Indonesia would fall into instability and the communists could capitalize on that and so on and so forth. So what happened is that the Americans also threw their support behind the Dutch, and they said, do not lose Indonesia, do not lose Indonesia. And so all these acts of violence were actually either condoned or there was a blind eye cast towards this whole thing. July 1947. However, by December 1948, just about 1.5 years later, the Dutch, they launched a second police action against the Indonesians. But at this point in time, what happened was that the Americans, they once again they changed their foreign policy track. They reversed their approach towards the entire thing, and they withdrew their support from the Dutch. And this was one of those amazing U-turns and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was the same set of considerations they had towards France in Vietnam as they here had towards the Dutch and in Indonesia. But I think a defining factor was also in the man of Sukarno. How did Sukarno change the minds of the Americans? So what happened was that the Americans, one of their biggest fears about Sukarno is that they didn't know who he was. I mean, but now we look back and we kind of know everything, but that's because we got historical distance, we've studied and so on and so forth. But back then, as the man was emerging, as Southeast Asia was emerging, as Indonesia was emerging, no one really knew Sukarno, at least not in the West, and especially not in the American circles. So, one of the biggest fears that they had about not knowing who he was that they didn't know his political allegiance. They know that Sukarno was willing to work with the communists. They know that Sukarno has that broad-based nationalist front, and they are willing, and he is willing to work with the communists. So, what happened at that point in time is that Sukarno he understands that this is a situation that is unsustainable. As long as the Americans don't turn their opinion against the Dutch, Indonesia would face a really difficult task in trying to get independence. So what happens is that in September 1948, in this place called Madiun, there is a revolt, and this revolt was quite, it was led and composed quite a number of communists in this revolt and all that. And Sukarno, the opportunist that he was, he decided to use this revolt as a means in order to showcase, as a performance, some sort of his loyalty and his allegiance and so on and so forth. So what Sukarno actually did is that he crushed the communists. He crushed this armed insurrection in the area of Madiun in East Java, and thereby proving to the outside world and to the international community, and most importantly to the Americans, that he was not going to let Indonesia fall to the communists. So when the Americans looked at the situation, that's, I think, one of the key points where American foreign policy started to switch against the Dutch and towards Indonesian independence. But what you can see here is that, and we've been through Vietnam and we've been through now Indonesia, we can see that Cold War politics, it really plays a defining role. It's perhaps the biggest influence of all. At this point in time, I don't know if the Americans really care about the Indonesian nationalist movement. I don't know if they really care about Indonesian independence per se, but the central question always is, will this country fall to communism? And therefore, we can see that Cold War politics seems to dominate
the influence over there seems to dominate across the entire decolonization process. So that's something for you guys to think about. So pretty much the same set of considerations when we try to understand how Indonesian decolonization played out. The Dutch and the Indonesians, they were unwilling to budge. One of them needed the colony for reconstruction. The other one wanted independence because it deemed it its right. The Americans, they intervened, and at the front part, it slowed down the decol, but at the later part, it hastened the decol process. So that's all the different forces interacting with one another in the case of Indonesia. So what eventually happened was that in 1949, the Dutch eventually left. They recognized Indonesian independence in 1949. However, today if you go to Indonesia, they would state 1945 as their date of independence, the one where Sukarno proclaimed independence for Indonesia. So this one is the Dutch recognition of Indonesian independence in 1949. Now, going on to Burma, at this point in time, their colonial power is the British. They had what the difference about Burma is that they were given independence by the Japanese, independence in inverted commas. Um, so even though that no one really recognizes this, even the Burmese themselves and Aung San especially, I don't think he really thought like, wow, Burma is free and that kind of stuff. I think he understood the realities of the situation and so on and so forth. But by the point of 1945, Burma, even though this independence is questionable, Burma has an expectation that because their nationalist movement has grown, because the situation is different from the pre-war state, therefore there's an expectancy that Burma would be given independence as well when the British come back. However, this was not to be the case, even though the British had serious concerns over empire and the overseas colonies. At 1945 itself, Britain came back to reassert their control, to re-establish their control. So it was only later on that the British also changed their considerations towards Burma. The points 3 and points 4 over here, you don't need to know the details of it too much, but basically what happens is that one of the British council members who was one of the authorities over Burma, he was replaced by someone else. And why was this so was because the Burmese nationalist movement was agitating against the things that Dorman Smith was saying. And then later on, because of that, he was replaced by Hubert Rance. So this why did I bring this up is because I want you to see that even though Burma didn't go through a period of active warfare, violent action and that kind of stuff, there were massive street protests, demonstrations, there was a lot of agitation on the ground. And this agitation, you can see, it's not something small, it is big, it is physical, it has some level of impact that the British are forced into reconsideration over their policies in Burma. So it does give you an idea that the nationalist strength in Burma is really strong. The last lens for Burma that I want you to consider is that the British increasingly saw the overseas colonies as unsustainable. I don't know if you guys know this, but Britain also had a colony in the form of India. And the Indian independence movement was even faster than the Burmese one. So by 1947, India was on the road to independence already, and it was going to be given independence soon, 1947. So what happens to Burma then? You can see the geography of this. What happens is that when India was going to be decolonized, Burma lost its strategic value because Burma was colonized by Britain in the first place to prevent the French coming over into India. So the British, they needed a buffer state, and this buffer state was Burma. But now that India is going to be independent and is going to be decolonized, Burma loses its strategic value. And so even the British, their mindset, their cost benefit analysis is going to weigh in the favor of granting Burma independence. So I want you to see that when there's a mutually agreed upon situation, when there is an amicable pathway, when negotiation is still on the table between the colonized and the colonial power, the decall timetable can be affected quite drastically. You can see that by January 1948, Burma is given independence. So going back to those four forces that we talked about, those things working in interaction with one another, it could determine the entire experience of decolonization. Now, what about for Britain's other colonies in Malaya and Singapore? Is the timetable going to be as fast as Burma's? The simple answer is no. And why was this so? Because for Malaya and Singapore, I would group these two together. For Malaya and Singapore, there was a huge economic and strategic advantage that these colonies offered to the British Empire. That's number one. Malaya is resource rich, and the resources are important to industry. So Britain, in its recovery path, would want to continue this line of resource. Malaya and Singapore are also strategically important because of their geographical location, and Singapore has a naval base, a British naval base, that is really important in strategic calculation. So both Malaya and Singapore would have that economic and strategic advantage. That's the more positive side of things. The more negative side of things was the fear that the communists would overrun Malaya and Singapore. Now, why is this so? Number one, because the communists themselves were the resistance fighters in the war, and they held a sizable following. Their nationalist credentials were also quite up there, and in the eyes of the people, they were one of them. They were one and with the people. So there's that fear of the communist track. But pretty soon, the communists in Malaya especially, they launched into their own insurrection. So there was violence and all that kind of stuff involved. So the whole territory of Malaya and Singapore was at a very unstable point. And the British, they weren't comfortable enough to say that there's enough stability over here for us to decolonize. So they continue to hold on to try to control the communist situation. So if you want to look at the timetable of Singapore and Malaya, it is for Malaya, when they are given independence, is 1957, so that's 12 years. And Singapore gets independence in 1963 because they joined the Federation of Malaysia. So 1963, that's a period of about 18 years. So you can see the timetable is stretched. But I would like to further qualify this experience that even though the timetable is long and it's stretched and all that, it wasn't characterized by warfare between the colonized and the colonial power. In fact, the relationship was quite amicable, it was quite diplomatic, there was a good collaborative relationship between the British, the Malayans, and the Singaporeans. So even though the timetable was extended and it was quite long, but I wouldn't say that it was as chaotic or as unstable as situations in Vietnam and in Indonesia. So the landscape of Southeast Asia kind of looks like this now, where when you're looking at Cold War politics and all that kind of stuff, even in Southeast Asia itself, it seems like bipolarity is forming as well. Because in Vietnam, there's a huge communist force over there. In Malaya and Singapore, same thing with the communists. And in Indonesia, there are huge question marks over the communists as well. And then you have the other bloc in the form of the allies, where you have Thailand and Philippines. They are military allies of the Americans, and then with the other case studies as well, they are either allied to the Americans or they are friendly to the Western Bloc. So there's this huge kind of showdown, Cold War type of atmosphere that is dawning upon Southeast Asia as well. And so I leave you to this. Tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, I will see you guys for the Manila conference. Of course, you do not have to align your cases to what actually did happen. As I mentioned to you all in the instructions, the Manila conference, it is based on your historical characters. Try to represent them as best as you can. But um, with regards to whatever you all decide during the Manila conference is it's kind of up to you. It is your world. It is hypothetical. It's fictional. So try to represent your characters well, but at the same time, the decisions that you make do not have to exactly align to how things played out. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it has been beneficial for you. We'll see you next time.